We know less about what they're doing than we did in the past because we don't know where they put the high enriched uranium. We don't know whether they have, how much they've been able to hold on to. So greater aspiration, less visibility is not a good combination. Now, that being said, I don't want to claim that they're very close to a bomb. No doubt. Even if Fordo and Natanz are not fully eviscerated, it's going to be very hard for the Iranians to dig out from under that rubble, see what's happening. And doing all that while we and the Israelis are going to be watching every step they take.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening? With me, your host, Chris Hayes. I'm speaking to you on June 25th, and the reason I make the date is because I want to tell you what's happened so far, which is the U.S. sent a number of bombers to bomb nuclear sites in Iran. We did this after the Israelis had started a military operation attacking Iran with missiles. Iranians had retaliated against Israel. At first, it seemed that Trump was telling Netanyahu not to attack Iran. Then, according to the reporting, he was watching Fox News where they were super psyched about what Netanyahu was doing. He got jealous of all the credit Netanyahu was getting. He then mobilized U.S. forces to do it. In fact, they had to kind of use a bunch of misdirection because he was being so sort of straightforward with people about what he was going to do. The mission dropped these MOP bunker buster bombs on these deep nuclear sites. As I speak to you now, it's unclear whether they obliterated, as the president says, those nuclear sites, or they did minimal damage, setting back the program just a matter of months. Also, then the president unilaterally declared a ceasefire on social media and got very angry at the Israelis, who in the last 6 hours before the ceasefire went into effect, sent an enormous barrage towards Iran, which is something they've done numerous times when there's been announced ceasefires. They do a sort of huge show of force in the waning hours that they can. Iran also retaliated in the waning hours. He cursed at reporters because he was so frustrated, and he says he thinks the peace between the two who've been fighting for thousands of years will last forever. And the reason I give you all that is because when you hear this, it's possible the war has started again. It's possible we bomb them again. It's possible that there's a negotiation happening between the U.S. and Iran. I have no idea, nor does really anyone else who's not living inside Donald Trump's head, and I don't even think he knows. All of this has been very confusing, and I set all this context forward because I want to talk about Iran, the U.S., and the nuclear program with some context. Because what seems irrefutable to me is that whatever was done or not done to the nuclear program, the deal that had been negotiated by the Obama administration and entered into with Iran, which involved monitoring and limits on uranium enrichment, was doing a better, more transparent job of stopping Iran from moving to a nuclear weapon than what came after, which was Donald Trump unilaterally tearing up the deal, the Iranians going back to enriching lots of uranium, and now a hot war between Israel that the U.S. joined. So I thought a great person to talk to would be the guy who was the lead negotiator on that deal. The person who sat in the room across from Iranian counterparts with members of the American diplomatic corps and security apparatus, a guy by the name of Rob Malley, who, by the way, has just a totally fascinating story himself. He's also got an amazing book that's going to come out this fall that I'm actually reading an advanced copy of called Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. That's a co-authored book. I want to have him back when that book is out. But today we're going to talk to Rob about his experience with the Iran nuclear deal and how to understand what we've seen and how to maybe go back in time and understand what that deal was and what was lost. So Rob Malley, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
I want to get into this, but first, can you have I did not know, you were on my show the other night, and I guess in the lead up to it, I just gave you a quick Google, and I was like, wait, what? And then
never do that.
I fell down a rabbit hole. Your background is totally fascinating. Can you tell me about your parents? Because I think that's a big part of this story, and your formation and how you ended up becoming a peace negotiator, sort of full time.
Yeah. So thanks. And again, you plugged the book, and I tell more of the story in the book. But my father was an Egyptian Jew. He was born in Cairo. His parents were from Aleppo, Syria, and he was a Jew, but he also was a very big believer in Arab nationalism and big believer in the Palestinian cause. And so, as a Jew in Egypt at that time, he had limitations because of his religion. And he had his convictions, which he couldn't really put into practice. And so he became a journalist, moved to the U.S., where he was a correspondent for a number of Arab newspapers at the United Nations, which had just been formed in 1945. And he continued his journalism as an outsider to the US, an outsider to Egypt because he was Jewish, but an outsider certainly to Judaism, but more specifically to Israel because he was an ardent, as I said, supporter of the Palestinian cause. He moves to France, from where he gets expelled because of his political views, which is pretty rare. I mean, now we see that the US is deporting people, foreigners, because of their political views, but in the early 1980s, to have an American journalist expelled from France because of his political views, that was pretty unusual. And so I grew up in that background. My mother, also Jewish, but from Eastern Europe. And where, as I say in the book, the first Palestinian I met happened to be Yasser Arafat, because my father knew him. And then the second time I met him, I was an advisor to President Clinton on Arab-Israeli affairs. How I landed in government, students ask me because they're interested in the career, and I say just serendipity or bad luck, as it may be, because I've had a pretty, if you look at Google or Wikipedia, you know that my career has been checkered and full of controversy.
Can I ask your mom? So your father is an Egyptian Jewish man who's a fervent anti-colonialist, Arab nationalist, and anti-Zionist, basically, but Jewish.
Yeah, right.
Sort of.
And then moves to America and becomes anti-American, which is
right.
Also.
And
then moves to France and is anti-France.
Your mom is from New York, right?
From the Bronx, yeah.
From the Bronx, which is where I'm from, and from a family of Ashkenazi Jews who'd come to the U.S. But she was working for the Algerian National Liberation Movement, the FLN, right, at the UN when she met your father.
That's right. That's how they met, because she volunteered.
That is wild, dude.
It is wild. So they meet while she is working for the Algerian delegation and he's covering it.
The FLN. She's working for the FLN, a Jewish New Yorker.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So she's another character in the story. It is pretty crazy. Yeah.
So I think, you get a Rhodes Scholarship, you go to Yale Law, you have a very impressive set of credentials. You have this very unique background. You speak a number of languages, as I understand it. You are raised sort of in a way I think very few people are, kind of across the, Jewish Arab divide, if we want to call it that. You end up getting involved in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in Camp David.
Right.
And then you were in Barack Obama's law school class at Harvard, is that right?
I was, and I knew him. I can't say that we were close friends, but I knew him well enough that when he ran in 2008, I served as a unofficial advisor, got kicked out of that position because in my real job, which was working for a nonprofit organization called the International Crisis Group, whose goal is to talk to all parties in conflict. And so, yes, I had spoken to members of Hamas. I never hit it, but opponents of Barack Obama made a big issue of it during the campaign. So I was asked to leave the campaign, and only in the second term, I think, when the president and his administration felt less politically vulnerable, did they bring me in to work on the Middle East more broadly.
So you were one of the people that negotiated the deal with Iran. Will you just take me through, what were the goals of that negotiation? What was your brief when you went into it of what the U.S. wanted out of that diplomacy?
So it was very clear what the president's guidance was. I mean, first, let's sort of take a step back. He was convinced that there were only two options with Iran. Either Iran was going to get a bomb or we were going to have to bomb Iran. We could debate whether that was really the only two options, but he saw that and he was under a lot of political pressure to make sure that Iran would not get a bomb. And he didn't want, particularly after the experience of Iraq, to be the president on whose watch yet another conflict in the Middle East were to be unleashed. So what he wanted a deal, and a deal that would take care of Iran's nuclear program, put it in a box for a significant period of time. So what he told the team was, I want a deal that for at least 10 years would put Iran at least 1 year away from the possibility of acquiring a bomb if they were to violate the deal. So from the day they violate the deal to the day that they could potentially have a bomb, we'd have a year to take whatever action, political, diplomatic, military, to stop them. So those were the criteria. So in some ways, it was as easy a negotiation as I've participated in. Not that it was easy, because the president laid out very, very clear criteria, terms of reference, and he wanted nuclear experts to validate the deal. He knew that Secretary Kerry, Wendy Sherman, myself were not nuclear scientists. He brought in his Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, but also a team of nuclear experts who would say at the end, we would vouch for the fact that if it were in place for at least 10 years, Iran would be at least 1 year away from the possibility of having a bomb with the most intrusive transparency measures ever negotiated in peacetime. So that was the goal. It was achieved. Again, I know they're critics of the deal, but I don't think the president was never hid what the goal was. It wasn't to make Iran a friend of the United States. It wasn't to end everything Iran did that the U.S. had objections to. It was to take care of this problem for a significant period of time. And by the way, he would say, I know this doesn't necessarily resolve it forever unless the Iranian regime changes, but this will give time for my successor's successor to negotiate a follow-on deal or to choose whatever course of action they want to.
If that's what the U.S. wanted, what was your understanding in these negotiations of what the nature of the Iranian program was and why they had what appeared to be a kind of sort of liminal program, right? Like they say it's for civilian purposes. Ostensibly it is. It's clearly there to give them an option to possibly pursue a weapon. It's, how much that's happening or not is a matter of debate. There are intelligence assessments. But it's a little hard for me to kind of read what the Iranians are up to because it feels a little like they've been caught like between first and second base and now they've been picked off. Like, it's like you're either a nuclear power, in which case you're North Korea and it's too late, no one can do anything, or Pakistan, which is a different regime, or you're trying to get it and everyone in the world is really focused on you not getting it. So what was their logic here?
So, and I think now they may look back and say that they made a mistake. Either they should have gone for it or not gone for it at all. They got caught in the middle, when they were most vulnerable. But I think to put yourself in the Iranian mentality, not to defend it, but I believe strongly, and you mentioned my background, if you don't put yourself in other people's shoes, you'll never understand how they're acting.
Yeah.
They came out of the Iran-Iraq War, which is one of the most devastating wars in the 1980s, and they were subjected to a barrage of rockets, chemical attacks. Virtually no country in the world sided with them. Every country, including countries that were at war or at odds with each other, were backing Iraq. And they felt at the time that they had been caught basically in a position of vulnerability, and they swore that they needed to have their own self-reliant strategy of defense, which involved, funding and arming militias outside of Iran, but also building a nuclear program, which, by the way, would also been the Shah's project to have a nuclear program. Now, I think any nuclear expert would say, given the size of their program, it had no legitimate civilian justification. It doesn't mean that they don't have a need for nuclear energy. Fossil fuels are not going to be endless. So yes, that made some sense. But the way it was constructed, it was pretty clear to anyone that it was a hedging strategy.
Yeah.
To be in a position to acquire a bomb if they wanted to. We know that at least until 2003, they were also engaged in a weaponization project to study how it could be done. It stopped in 2003, I think. All intelligence agencies agree with that. But so their strategy was to keep this as a leverage, to keep it as a hedging option, and then maybe to negotiate limitations on it in exchange for concessions from the U.S. So it ends up being probably one of the most dramatically miscalculated enterprises one could think of. But you can understand what they were doing. They wanted it in their back pocket. Now, you said something very important, which is, I think, if I were the supreme leader of Iran, which fortunately I'm not, I would say I could imagine over the last several years a moment when I would say to myself, I need a nuclear bomb. Libya gave it up. Gaddafi was toppled. Saddam Hussein didn't have it. He was toppled. The North Koreans have it, and they've been spared. So with Iran's
look at Ukraine too. Ukraine had weapons which were given up as part of a deal in the early 1990s, and look what happened to Ukraine.
And look at how much we've debated. How much can we go after the Russians, given the possibility that so I think as people know, he issued this fatwa, this religious edict against any effort to acquire a bomb. My conviction is if he had a way to go from today to acquiring a bomb with nobody knowing it, doing it overnight, sort of, like that, he would have done it. But he knew he couldn't. He knew that there was a period of months during which the US, Israel, others might know that he was doing, and that was when he'd be exposed to maximum danger. So he had this hedging strategy. He couldn't really use it. And we were trying to put it in a box so that it would be even further away from his mind.
Now, part of the hedge, my understanding, if you're the version of Rob Malley on the other side of the table, the Iranians, that they seem willing to give up. I mean, in the end, they were, right? They're willing to put their program in a box in exchange for something. What's the something they're looking for?
They're looking for sanctions relief. I mean, this devastating, crippling sanctions, that's one of the legacies of the Obama administration, for better or for worse. We could have hours long of conversations about the ethical and moral and political value of sanctions, which I think have been wildly overused. But it is true that Iran wanted those sanctions lifted because it was really hurting their ability to be developed economically. I think where we have it often wrong is we think that the threat of sanctions and the imposition of sanctions is enough to get a country to surrender. That was what certainly President Trump thought, and also some others, some Democrats have thought over the years, just maximum coercion, sanctions, threat of military intervention, the Iranians are going to give up what they have. Again, put yourself in their shoes. It's precisely because they feel that vulnerable that they're not going to give up their one asset just because of coercion. They're going to want something in exchange.
It's interesting that you raise the Iraq-Iran war as this kind of originary trauma. Obviously, it starts almost immediately after the 1979 revolution. I think there's 600,000 or 700,000 fatalities on the Iranian side, or even more than that. I mean,
so the numbers estimates up to 1 million. Yes.
Yeah, it's just a truly shocking charnel house. I mean, it sort of exists outside of the, I think, American consciousness, because it was just like, oh, two countries over there are fighting, but really one of the bloodiest and most brutal kind of modern wars. It's interesting you understand it sort of in relation to that as opposed to Israel. And Israel obviously is an undeclared nuclear power. Everyone knows that, but no one says it. They're not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. How much is it about Israel, I guess is the question. The Israelis think it's all about them. And again, I understand why they do, because it's a regime that's implacably hostile to them, no question, both in actions and words. But how much do you think it was about Israel?
It's hard to disentangle, right? I mean, they do have this ideological foundation of being anti-Israel, anti-US. It's been sort of the raw material on which the revolution has sought to prosper for a long time. Whether the reason they developed a nuclear weapon or tried to develop a nuclear weapon years past was because of Israel or because of just their sense of encirclement, because it's not just Israel. I mean, Iran, as I said, during the Iran-Iraq war was being, Iraq was being supported by the United States, by the Gulf countries, by Europeans, by Russia. So you're talking about a country that really was almost on its own. So, and, then in later years, it has the United States at its border in Afghanistan, in later years still in Iraq. So to some extent, nuclear powers that are surrounding it from both sides, Pakistan, India. So I don't think it's only about Israel. The Israel piece certainly matters as an ideological component of the revolution. Whether they, and this is where, you hear Israelis and others say two things that are very hard to sort of put together. On the one hand, they say that Iran is a fanatical, irrational regime which could use a nuclear weapon against Israel if it had one. On the other hand, it's rational enough that it's going to give in to pressure, to coercion, to threats. So pick one. It's one or the other. They're not both rational and going to give in to rational arguments about the pressures, but also so irrational that they would basically commit suicide by using a nuclear weapon against a power that not only could retaliate in kind, but has allies that could retaliate several times fold. So
how hard? So in hindsight, the negotiations seem clear, right? You want a verifiable inspections regime with hard limits on the kinds of things that would be necessary precursors for weaponization, which is enriching uranium to 90%, which is weapons grade, civilian use of uranium is around 5%. This is the big delta. That's a thing that the International Atomic Energy Administration can monitor if, they're allowed to. And in exchange, they want sanctions relief. So that's sort of the trade here. Yeah. How hard were those negotiations?
I mean, they lasted for a very, very long time. They started before I joined the Obama administration, and they lasted for a long time because every issue you said is so technically complicated How do you make sure, what are the steps they need to take to be a year away from the possibility of acquiring a bomb? What are the steps you need to take so that it's so visible, so transparent that we would know early enough, and the IEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, would know well ahead of time that they were trying to break out. And the sanctions relief, again, which turned out to be extremely complicated because we once described this as a spider web. The sanctions are so interrelated that you could take one off, two off, three off, but if the others remain, you can't really benefit from anything. So that took a long time. A lot of distrust. People always say, you're naive, you're trusting the Iranians. I think really that's not a fair accusation, because there were so many layers of guarantees and of transparency and monitoring. My people like to, again, if you looked on Wikipedia, they like to depict me a bit as a dogmatic or one-sided, fanatic. I really do try to listen to my critics, and I think on the JCPOA, those who say it wasn't tight enough, I think nuclear experts at the time, objective ones, recognized that it did do what it said it would do: keep Iran away from a bomb at least for a year, for 10 years. I think the fair criticism is, what about the out years? What happens after year 10, 12, 13, 14, 15? By 2030, so 5 years from now, had we still been in the deal, many of the constraints would have been off. But again, the question is, if you have 10 to 15 years, can you try to either build a better relationship with Iran, and if that proves impossible, negotiate another deal, a deal that would continue, as it happens often in arms treaties agreements. You have follow-on agreements all the time.
SALT II, yeah.
Exactly. So again, I take the criticism. I think it was really often issued in bad faith, because now we see those same people who are applauding military action, which is not putting back Iran's nuclear program by that much or by much more.
Well, so here's my question to you. If we're dealing with a bunch of rational actors here, right, with different motives, different institutional bearings, and different experiences that color, but fundamentally rational actors, the U.S. a rational actor, Iran and Israel's a rational actor. Now, so what happens is the deal finally gets announced and ironed out. It's very clear it can't be a treaty because it won't have the votes. The constitutional votes. So you need 66 votes. There's no way they're going to get 66 votes. Now, part of the reason they're not going to get 66 votes is that the Israeli government hates this deal. And the Israeli lobby in the U.S., which is a fairly strong lobby, particularly on these issues, is going to lobby against it immediately. And in fact, you even get very high-profile Democrats like Chuck Schumer, current Senate minority leader, and Robert Menendez, recently reported to prison, who are staunch opponents of the deal. Why are the Israelis, why do they hate this deal so much? If it does what you say it does.
So again, I spend a lot of time trying to understand the Israeli perspective. I think they have convinced themselves that any remote possibility that Iran could acquire a bomb would be an existential threat. Some Israelis have challenged that. But I do think if you had played out this deal, it did mean that Iran would have greater economic resources, no doubt about it.
Right.
And they could use those resources in all kinds of ways. And I don't think either President Obama or his team were naive in thinking that none of that money would go to supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the ballistic missile program. I mean, those are always priorities. So even under sanctions, they spend a disproportionate amount of their money on what they consider to be their national security objectives. But sanctions or no sanctions, they would do it. And without sanctions, they'd have more with which to do it. So I think Israel didn't like the prospect of an Iran that would be more normal, have more international economic transactions with Europe, with the US perhaps. That, given their relationship with Iran, was something they considered a threat, and they did what they could to undo it.
Right. And so that's interesting. So from the US perspective, if you're single-mindedly like, they cannot have a nuclear weapon. There's a whole bunch of issues we have with them. Let's put those aside for a moment. Let's work on this and let's get to yes on this. And then you do that, right? And it's pretty transparent and they're not enriching uranium. And from the Israeli perspective, it's like they have encircled us with what they call the axis of resistance. They're helping Assad in Syria and his civil war. They're funding Hezbollah right to our north. There's money from them flowing into Hamas. They're also helping the Houthis, right? The Saudis also view them as fundamentally, opposed to their interests and encircling them. And for a bit of time, there's a kind of Saudi-Iran proxy war being waged in Yemen. So from the Israeli perspective, it's like if you get rid of the nuclear threat, but you trade this sort of money / a pathway to something that looks like normalization, that's very, very threatening to them.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was caught on by his own argument. He's the one, you remember, he had this cartoonish
I
picture of an
remember. Oh,
Iranian
yeah.
bomb and saying if you enrich at over 20%, whatever. So they made this nuclear issue into the be-all and end-all
Right.
of
And
the
then
Iranian
you
threat.
called the bluff.
Exactly. And so then Obama comes and says, I'm taking care of it for you. And they say, well, what about all the rest? So, they had made and Obama made the argument, yes, we get all the rest, but imagine all the rest with a nuclear bomb. So we're going to at least take care of that problem. So I do think, to that extent, the Israelis were a bit caught up in their own argument, and they couldn't really find, they weren't able to block the deal despite all their efforts in the U.S. They had more success when President Trump was in office.
Right. So, I mean, what ends up happening is this becomes a huge issue on the right, and even not just the right, among some Democrats, and particularly for AIPAC and for lobbyists on the Hill. And Trump says he's going to rip it up if he gets elected. He gets elected. At first, it looks like maybe he's not going to do it. I think he's kind of counseled not to, but then he does.
Yeah. Then
you're the envoy in the Biden administration. And my understanding is there's some talks about getting the band back together.
Yeah.
That end up not going anywhere. I mean, I feel like I don't really need to know much to understand why it didn't go anywhere, because why would anyone do this a second time? But what was the second time around like?
So first, I don't want to jump over too quickly. I don't want to spend much time, but the decision by President Trump to withdraw from the deal, there are many people here, and some Democrats, as you said, who believed in his theory of the case, which is maximum pressure, what he called absolute, trying to bring their Iranian oil exports to zero, getting everyone to abide by those sanctions. That would lead Iran to give up its program or to give up its network of allies and come to the table and surrender. It didn't happen. And it is so clear when you look at the graphics of how, and I think, you've shown them.
We showed it on my show, yeah.
Right, how Iran's nuclear program, its level of enrichment, number of centrifuges, research and development, everything exploded gradually, but since 2018. So that theory of the case, I think we really need to put to rest. Now, you're asking about the Biden administration. It's still a bit raw, as you know, and out of fairness, I was suspended in 2023 for reasons that they're still unclear to me. But my sense is both sides, both their Supreme Leader and our Supreme Leader, President Biden, were okay with the deal, but not desperate for one. And they could live without it, and they felt that the other side needed it more than they did. I think they were wrong on both counts. I think both needed it more than they thought, and both overestimated how much the other one wanted it. So we started a bit slowly. We started late. We started talking even about, well, we need a deal that's going to be longer and stronger, which were talking points from the Republicans, but we kind of endorsed them. But at one point, I think the White House decided, yeah, well, let's try to get it. We never got there. Many reasons. I think there's one reason, and you just alluded to it, which maybe we never were able to overcome. If you're the Iranian leadership and you know what happened in 2018, and you're saying to the Americans, give us a guarantee it won't happen again, and they asked us that constantly. Our answer was, indirectly, because they wouldn't speak to us directly, we can't give you a guarantee. There's nothing in U.S. law that will prevent a future president, even if we made it a treaty, which we can't. We've seen a future president could rip it up. And I think they were wondering whether President Trump himself may not be the successor. So I don't know. Looking back, I'm not sure what it would have taken for them to agree to dismantle their program once more, agree to these intrusive inspections, and then sign on to the deal, only to see it, the sort of Lucy and the football happen to them. Once again, I think in that sense, they may have made a mistake, because if the deal had been reached early on, at a minimum, they would have been able to benefit from some of the sanctions relief. And then, if the deal was torn up, the deal was torn up. But I think there was a combination of factors, as I say, sort of tepid views on both sides, divisions on both teams, both the American team and the Iranian team. And I thought, not early on, but it dawned on me at some point that if neither side really wants it, we're not going to get there.
I'm very curious. I've never been part of high stakes international negotiations. So what's the room like? Like, will you just take me through a day of the Iran negotiations? Like, literally, like, it's a hotel room in some third country. There's 10
It depends which negotiations, 2015 or 2021. They're very different because the Iranians.
So the 15 ones were directly with the Iranians.
Right.
Right. So what were those like? Where were they, and what was a day like in those
So
negotiations?
those were in Vienna, and I think I now teach, and this is something I always find fascinating to teach people who are interested in diplomacy, because in order for the U.S. to negotiate with Iran, first you needed agreement within the U.S. team, and it wasn't a given. I mean, not everyone had exactly the same view. You had some people whose memories of Iran were only of Iran backing and funding and giving weapons to Iraqi Shia militia that had killed Americans. So they were not at all happy about the notion of sanctions relief. So you had to bring all the American team together. Then you had to get the Americans on the same page as the Europeans, our allies, but some of them had different views, the French, the Germans, and the UK. You also had to bring in the Russians and the Chinese because they were part of what's known as the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany who were negotiating with Iran. You had to make sure Congress was not, and Democrats in Congress in particular, not too far afield. You had the Israel factor, you had the Gulf Arab factor. They at the time were not in favor of a deal. And only at that point do you then face the Iranians. So it was a multi-layered negotiation. I'm sure the Iranians had their own, they had their own factions. The people at the tables tended to be, quote unquote, more pragmatic than the ones back home. So the mere fact that it happened in some ways is a miracle, but I think it went to the bottom line of what was missing in 2021. Obama felt strongly, we need this deal or we're going to go to war. And the Iranians felt strongly, if we don't have this deal, and they thought this deal would last, our economy could be in shambles. So the mathematics of the deal, the geometry of the deal worked, the physics of the deal worked in 2015-16 at some, there were shouting matches that Secretary Kerry had with the Iranian foreign minister at the time, Javad Zarif, people walking out of rooms, throwing their papers, pens flying.
I mean, wait, to say more about that though, like in what so again, you're in a room, you're in a hotel room somewhere, or you're in a.
Yeah, it was in Vienna. There's this one hotel, the Kohlberg Hotel, where all the, we were there nonstop for actually a month. So there were other negotiations before, but the bulk of it was 1 month.
So you walk into is it one room with a big table?
So if it's, as I just described, there are different layers, but when we met one-on-one with the Iranians, it's one room with one table. They're on one side, we're on the other. Most of the talking is between the leadership, John Kerry and Javad Zarif. And Javad Zarif could get very emotional. Part of it was choreographed and jump up and have coughing fits and leave the room. But
you sit there. Wait, you sit there taking notes. How many does each team have?
I'd say there are probably 4 or 5, and then there were the technical teams that were meeting at the same time. Because I'm no nuclear expert, I'm not a sanctions expert. So you had Treasury Department and nuclear physicists meeting with their Iranian counterparts at the same time. It really was a 5-ring circus, and I give a lot of credit to Wendy Sherman. She was the political director at the time, and just to herd these cats, and by cats I mean the U.S. team, and then get all the others online. That was not an obvious thing, but and I don't put too much stock in the notion that it's a matter of personal chemistry. I think if national interests dictate that you're going to get a deal, you're going to get a deal. But the chemistry between Secretary Kerry and the foreign minister of Iran, they had many fights, but they had sort of a basic understanding. Secretary Moniz, a nuclear expert, Ali Salehi, who was his counterpart on the Iranian team, both had gone to MIT, so they would trade stories about professors they knew. So none of that is to say that we were chummy buddies and that we knew that everything was going to be fine, but that did help. What helped more than anything, I think, as I said, was a decision at the top that it was worth their national interest to take the obvious risks that both sides were taking to reach a deal.
What was your reaction when the deal got ripped up in the Trump administration?
So I think we saw it coming. It wasn't as if...
No, he said he was going to do it.
Said he was going to do it. It was almost surprising that it lasted sort of a year or so, but then he was surrounded by people in his administration at that time. Initially, as you said, by people who were a little more reluctant to tear it up. The Europeans were telling them, no, let's try to negotiate some added aspects of the deal that are going to address your concerns, but let's not rip it up. I really didn't know what would happen then. I did suspect that President Trump would want to do his own deal. He didn't like the fact that it was an Obama deal. Maybe he could do his own, and it could be different from the JCPOA, obviously. But the basic trade-off, limitations on the nuclear program, lifting of sanctions, that's going to be true no matter what the deal looks like. And so I thought maybe he could do it as long as it was under with his big signature at the end of the document.
And it looked like that was the avenue he was pursuing this time around.
Sure.
I mean, Steve Witkoff, his sort of personal envoy, who's like a New York real estate dude with, no, I think, formal experience in state-to-state international negotiations. He's flying to the Gulf, to Oman, when the Israelis started launching their missiles at Iran. Where do you think the actions of the last few weeks leave the region?
So first, just a comment, because you're absolutely right. I mean, Steve Witkoff, in some ways, was making more progress than one would have expected because he came at it without any of the baggage and the sort of conventional thinking. He was open-minded.
Also, he didn't have to do any cat herding. I mean, the thing about the way that administration works, it's like a personalist dictatorship. So it's like the supreme leader. So he doesn't have to he's not running an interagency process. He's not getting buy-in from the diff people at state and blah, blah, blah. I know how these bureaucracies function, the thing you were just describing. So it's just like you're making a deal with the guy's guy, with the boss's guy.
And I'd say this, I mean, this may be controversial. I think there are aspects of the Trump presidency that we need to, if not emulate, think about more, is that he was not captive to the foreign policy establishment. He wasn't captive to the whole sort of democratic, conventional foreign policy thinking, which leads to a lot of the assumptions about Iran and assumptions about what we can and cannot do and who we can talk to and who we can't talk to. President Trump is above all that. I mean, he feels like he's indebted to nobody. He's the king, as you say. And so only what he wants is what is his movement, right? That's why he says America first is whatever I say it is. The flip side of that, I mean, if his instincts then were sort of, let's try to do something that's, good for peace, good for whatever, but isn't what he falls back on, if it's not the foreign policy establishments, are his instincts, his ego, his narcissism, his delusions of grandeur. And so I think we need to take from his presidency the capacity to overcome some of those cobwebs and those conventions that I think have haunted the Democratic Party for too long, and have a more progressive foreign policy, but that doesn't follow an individual's instincts.
Well, a great example of this is direct negotiations with Hamas for American hostages.
100%.
It was insane to me that Biden didn't do that.
Yep. So we'll come to that when we talk about the book. But so coming back to what I think happened and where this leaves us. First, I'm not a psychologist, and I think you'd have to be a psychologist to really understand where President Trump was going. I think he was, it's sort of seat of the pants. I think he wanted a deal if he could get one. He would wanted it to be quick. He wanted to be clean. And if Steve Witkoff could have gotten that, he would have. He got a bit bored with it.
He doesn't want to do a lot of work is a key thing here. Like he doesn't, he's not going to put his nose to the grindstone for 5 months.
No, he'll let exactly. And so that's why he said 2 months, which was always unrealistic. And then he gets, the Iranians are not surrendering. They are not going to give up their right to enrich, which is what they were being asked to do at some point. And then he was getting countering pressures from the MAGA movement, from others in the Republican Party, from Israel. And he was presented with this option, which is you could be the first American president to do what nobody else dreamt of, which is to actually get rid of the nuclear program by using this amazing bomb, the first time it will be used in wartime, extraordinary. And your hand will then be much stronger to get the Iranians to surrender in the way you want them to. And I think at that point, it just became knowing that Israel might do it anyway, and he didn't want to stop them. That became the more tempting option. I mean, where we are today, it's kind of odd because all three sides are claiming victory, right? Iran is saying, we stood up to the great and the lesser Satan, and we're still standing. And for all their, delusions of regime change and getting rid of our nuclear program, we still have it and we're still here. Netanyahu can say he's the first prime minister of Israel who actually went after this nuclear program, which has been defined as an existential threat, and managed to bring an American president to attack the program. That's a huge victory. I know there's controversy, but I think it's clear to say that the nuclear program has been set back. And President Trump could say, I'm the one who both went to war, constrained the Israelis, and then got a ceasefire. The problem is when you have three countries or entities that are so opposed to one another that each one thinks that they won, at least one of them is wrong, and that's where. And I'm afraid that one of them is going to find that out.
That seems right. I mean, how much did you guys, you talked about you're not obviously technical expert on this stuff, but there are a bunch of technical questions now about what the bombs did and didn't do, how far it's been set back. I saw an Israeli intelligence assessment that said that Fordo, which is one of the three, it's Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, was inoperable. Yesterday, there was a leaked Defense Intelligence Agency low confidence assessment saying that basically a temporary setback of about 6 months in terms of the timeline of weaponization. There's a question about where all the highly enriched uranium went. There's a question about whether there are facilities that are even deeper underground or adjacent. How much do you know about that? And what would you even be looking for to understand the status of the program?
So, I mean, it is very murky. I'd say, as the dust is still settling, we're in a situation where the Iranians probably want to bomb more than they did in the past.
Yeah,
we know, right? And that would make sense, right? We know less about what they're doing than we did in the past because we don't know where they put the high enriched uranium. We don't know whether they have, how much they've been able to hold on to. So greater aspiration, less visibility is not a good combination. Now, that being said, I don't want to claim that they're very close to a bomb. No doubt. Even if Fordo and Natanz are not fully eviscerated, it's going to be very hard for the Iranians to dig out from under that rubble, see what's happening, and doing all that while we and the Israelis are going to be watching every step they take. So I do think a military option was the wrong one for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't fully take care of the problem. It leads to all kinds of uncertainties and unpredictable outcomes that I think we're going to live with, not just in the coming days, weeks, but also months and years. But so I think that it was the wrong option to take, but I'm not going to say that I expect Iran is going to get a bomb anytime soon. I think, as the president said, it's probably not foremost on their mind, but I think we have planted the seed, as you're saying, of a regime that thinks, at some points we may have to do it because nothing else has worked.
What do you think about the broader context here is, my understanding, my read of the Israeli mindset on this is basically goes like this. October 7th was a wake-up call. We can't tolerate threats on our border from anyone. We are going to destroy Hamas, which has as of yet not actually happened, which I think even Israeli intelligence and political leaders will tell you is the truth. But we're going to kind of, there's a memo that Donald Rumsfeld writes, I want to say maybe on September 11th or maybe a day after. It's a famous memo where he says, clean it all up, things related and not. And that becomes essentially the seeds of the U.S. war in Iraq. There's a sort of similar logic you can see here, which is this is a wake-up call, and they have had spectacular military intelligence successes against Hezbollah. Hezbollah is probably weaker than it's been in a long time. The Assad regime, which is an antagonistic regime next door, and a Shia regime that's, Alawite regime, but Shia and sympathetic to the Iranians and backed by them, has fallen. And the Iranians are looking weaker than they've ever looked. And so from their perspective, from just a strategic perspective, it's like when you got the enemy on their back, you kick them in the head.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my good friend Matt Duss, who I'm sure you know, came up with this expression. In Gaza, what Israel's been doing now for a decade plus is what they call mow the lawn. Every time they thought that Hamas would rear its head again, they would mow the lawn and take care of it. We saw what happened on October 7th. But as Matt Duss says, we now have a regional mow the lawn strategy, which is anytime because they have such superiority, complete mastery of the air, complete mastery of land where they want to, anytime they see even the potential of a putative threat, they'll take care of it. And they'll take care of it preventively, preemptively, everything that international law says you shouldn't, but that's not their preoccupation right now. So I think we're going to see that in the West Bank. We have seen it, and not enough attention has been given to that. Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, despite the fact that we now have a regime in Syria that says we don't want anything to we have no hostile intentions towards Israel. They still are going after it to weaken it as much as possible.
They bombed Syria before it had a government. They took preventative bombings against Syria before there was even a government to be at war with.
Right. But, if put myself in every kind of shoe. I get it from Israel's
Oh,
perspective.
totally. Yeah.
When else will
Yeah.
they have this opportunity? I mean, my complaints go more to the U.S. under the Biden administration. My expectations of Trump were not as much, and of the Europeans. That's a different issue. But I mean, the fact that Israel had this appetite, and an appetite was only going to get greater because of what they suffered, really suffered on October 7th. That was a trauma that they still haven't gotten over, but also because they saw how much success they could have. So when was this going to come again? I think it's, others had the responsibility to try to think longer term, and they failed.
How do you think about your relationship to the region as the son of two Jewish Arab nationalists, I guess, and someone who's worked across the divide and has been a negotiator for the great American hegemonic empire, which has done a lot of pretty nasty things in that region? Not all, but some. How do you assess? I don't know, like, how do you feel emotionally about all this? Or are you such a professional and you've done this for so long that there's like not you're distance enough from it?
No, I don't think I'm distanced enough from it. And it's not just now. I mean, frankly, anyone who's worked on the Middle East now for I don't know how long, and whether it's Israel, Palestine, or the rest of the region, it's been almost one heartbreak after another. And the notion of a new generation now of Arabs, Muslims, who are going to grow up with this image of the United States, this image of Israel, this image of the West, is not something that I think anyone could look at and be complacent about. I mean, you started with my father, which I appreciate. I'm not my father. I don't have the same views as he had.
Yeah.
And I think he was quite stunned. And then, as you said, I mean, they maybe stole the words from his mouth. How could his son be working for the evil empire? But I took from that, I think I could understand, not perfectly, but better than many of my colleagues, how it looks from the outside, how some of our actions, whether we could still take them, but let's not pretend that we could come up with these moral arguments that they're going to believe in. And of course, the double standard between Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza. And again, things that we could talk about when we talk about the book. But I think a sensitivity to that is something that sometimes is lacking, and that from my upbringing, it is maybe easier for me to get. Again, you reach whatever policy conclusion you want to, but don't kid yourself into thinking that the image of the U.S. that you want to project is the one that's being received.
The trauma that you talk about, which I think is kind of not separable from everything that followed. I mean, Netanyahu has wanted to do this for 20 years. He's on the record. The Israelis did bomb the Iraqi nuclear facilities when Saddam Hussein had them, and I think to be honest, probably a good move. Like, that probably ended up being the right thing. I think the Israelis certainly think that. I think a lot of there are a lot of people who think, yeah, that probably bought the world some optionality that was then sort of destroyed by the American invasion. But I guess I feel like that trauma is the trauma and the sentence of existential peril ends up being at the core of Israeli action, and then kind of American political action, because the people that feel that trauma the most powerfully are the folks that are working the hardest on the Hill to support Israel in a mission that they view totally, I think, uncynically, right? Like they all believe it's existential, and that's part of the power and the force of their mobilizing.
Yeah, I mean, listen, and I don't want to claim that I can understand either the Israeli psyche or even our psyche, but I do think, as you say, it's almost hard to disentangle to what extent the feelings of existential threat are genuine, and then to what extent they become sort of manipulated and operationalized in order to achieve other goals. And one bleeds into the other. And so I hear from Israelis who I take very seriously, who are serious people. And as I say, they speak about Iran as an existential threat. And, the contradiction I pointed to earlier, an irrational actor when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, but a rational actor when it comes to the threat of the use of force and of sanctions, but also a country which is an existential threat, but also a country that you could dispose of in basically a week. I mean, these contradictions live in Israeli minds. I do think there's some in Israel who are very cynical about this, and others, that's what you've been grown up to believe, and you don't really know anymore what is truth and what is fiction. I do think that applies very much to us. There's some dogmas that if you want to be part of the grand priesthood of American foreign policy, you can't question. I hope that that change that has begun to change, at least with some members of Congress and with the younger generation, certainly on campuses. But there is this sort of this collection of dogmas that if you dare question them, you risk no longer being invited in the room, and people want to be in the room in order to have some impact. But I think those are all great questions about how much of this is genuine, how much of this has become, politicized.
Where do you see this leaving Iran? I mean, you're not specifically like an Iran expert, but you did, spend a lot of time working on this and being the Iran envoy. I mean, they are a much weaker regime now in terms of projection of force abroad. I think for a very long time, everything that I've read and from people I trust who are not just kind of, propagandistic, like regime change obsessed neocons, like it is a decrepit regime inside, like its amount of support. I was talking to a journalist who's very interesting, who was talking about the difference between like Chinese state minders and Iranian state minders, and how like the Chinese state minders like take their job seriously and like know what like are part of the ruling party and also want to do their job. And the Iranian state minders are like, you could be like, just like, let me do my thing for a day and then you'll still collect a paycheck. They would like let you do it. Like there was like a real difference in just like the vibrancy at the ground level of just sort of regime control. And I wonder where you think this leaves the regime.
So I think we have to think in phases, short and long. I mean, people who thought that the Israeli strikes on Iran was going to lead to an uprising, obviously they had that wrong. I mean, there's a lot of anger, you said it, from the people against the regime. But when you're being bombed by another country and they're bombing not just nuclear facilities, but hospitals and killing civilians, I have a lot of friends, Iranian Americans who live here, very anti-regime, but their family members back home were saying, what the hell's going on, and were becoming more nationalist. So I think there's that. It doesn't necessarily translate at all into support for the regime, but support for Iran qua Iran. Yeah. I think longer term, and we could think when it just talk about the Iranian people, I think there's going to be a reckoning at some point. I mean, think of a regime that has spent hundreds of billions of dollars since the revolution on what? On a nuclear program, ballistic missile program, air defense, an alliance with Russia and China, proxy militias or militias like Hezbollah. All of it is up in smoke, and what do they have left to show for it?
Exactly.
So that reckoning will come. When it comes, I don't know. And again, people who talk about regime change around the corner, first of all, when it comes from the outside, we have a terrible record at doing it. And even from the inside, I mean, you have a regime that seems to be prepared to kill and die to survive. I'm not sure that the people right now want to go through that. At some point, the regime will collapse. I think this is not the kind of regime that is made to last forever. But I don't know when that time will be. And it itself is thinking very long term. I'm sure right now this is just one scene in a very long movie in terms of its relationship with the U.S. and with Israel. And at some point, they'll be thinking, how do they make sure that the next stage of the movie is more to their liking?
Robert Malley was the lead negotiator for the 2015 nuclear deal. He's a lecturer at Yale University. He's got a book that will come out this September called Tomorrow's Yesterday, Life, Death, and Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. It's out in September. It's co-authored with Hussein Agha, and I would love to have you two gentlemen back on the program for that book. It was great to have you, Rob. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for giving me the time. It's always good to be with you, Chris.